So, kind of getting close here. Next Thursday, we'll kind of have the exam in class. And that's what the syllabus states prior to kind of going on spring break. So we'll kind of have like a reset. And so all the material prior to spring break will be on that exam. Everything after will be on the final day. So not kind of comprehensive. The two homeworks will be really good study guides. So I put up the first homework kind of answer key on Canvas. So there's like a folder that has the homework file and the answer key in it now. As soon as I get kind of done grading, going through those second homeworks, just kind of, I'll probably go through first just to make sure all the uploads look right. That way I can kind of get that answer key uploaded tomorrow. So you'll have that to look at as well. I also put up on something called midterm materials. So basically it's kind of like a practice exam. I call them just practice problems. So the exam will be a mix of multiple choice and short answer. So, on the short answer, I'm looking for a lot of the times graphs there, kind of short descriptions similar to a lot of the problems on the homework. So the short answer will look a little bit more like the homework, and then you'll kind of have a small subset of multiple choice questions as well. On Tuesday, I'll kind of have a little more of the exact numbers. I'm still kind of finalizing, figuring out exactly, how many multiple choice relative to short answer I want, which questions I want to be multiple choice or short answer. So we'll have a little more details about that next week. But these would be a good kind of set of problems to look at as well. And then I also have an answer key posted for those. Okay. So those will be kind of the homeworks, and then these practice problems will be kind of your study materials. I would go through also, anything where we've drawn graphs in the notes, like those are always good things to know how to do. A lot of times there's homework questions or one of these practice problem questions that correspond to that. But there might be one or two that don't end up there. Okay. Any questions for me before we kind of jump into material? Like I said, I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of the exam on Tuesday, but it will be in class, okay, next week on Thursday. So where we're kind of leaving off, or the last material, I'll probably introduce a little bit of new material on Tuesday and then kind of do some review. And if we don't have a lot of time for review, I might post an additional video next week. So you kind of have me kind of working through some of those practice problems or additional problems. Okay. So we left off kind of thinking about positive and negative externalities to teams locating in cities or building their stadium in a certain area. And some of the things we said is, maybe it brings more people in, increasing the exports, which is a positive externality for the city. Local businesses, restaurants, bars see increases in demand. Right. Just kind of, this is like more of like a summarization of what we did last class. Potentially, right, a new stadium in an area could bring in new restaurants, new hotels, and so maybe we see an increase in jobs, right? But if we think about kind of the revenue that's directly or indirectly related to the stadium, right, it's going to be a wide variety, right? So the short answer is do we have a complete kind of one way or the other answer, and it's no, right? It depends. Okay. So, right, there's going to be these huge additional costs. We can identify some positive externalities that might exist, but there's also going to be negative externalities. I think the examples I gave is an increase in traffic, potential increase in noise, increase in crime potentially, if you think that alcohol use and crime are related at all, which people do. We were with a bunch of economists last night, and we were talking about, alcohol plus time equals bad decisions, right? So I think that, that's a negative externality that could probably exist as well, okay? So, we also talked about last class, it also depends on what city we're looking at, right? Larger markets, it's likely that stadium didn't exist there. It'd be something else, right, that generated some additional revenue for the city. So it's not just the amount, you can't just look at revenue numbers for that year, you can't look at the number of new establishments, because it's how many additional establishments or how much additional revenue is brought in relative to what would exist if the stadium wasn't there. Now, if the stadium not being there is that nothing would be there, like in some of these smaller market towns, then yeah, that might, the additional revenue or the additional number of new restaurants, bars, or whatever, hotels, that might just simply be the additional revenue of restaurants, bars, hotels. But if something like a museum or another sports team would have been there as opposed to the team that's building there, well, then it's really the difference between those, right? The difference in revenue from if this team is located there relative to a museum. or whatever the other kind of leisure activity or leisure amenity we want to think about is. Okay. So it gets pretty hard to really tease out what the impacts of these stadiums locating in certain areas is. And I think maybe I don't, oh, I know. So one thing we can kind of relate to, and this is probably more of like a 202 thing, so I'm a little bit of macro here, but if there is this boost in income, right, it's bringing in additional workers, increasing current workers' salaries, even just bringing in the players. If you think about kind of the millions of dollars that they have to spend in the city, then we're going to be thinking about every $1 that this team brings in, right, is going to have kind of a multiplier effect, right? So it won't just be the individual's incomes, right? Once they spend that dollar, it'll be whoever. If that restaurant owner spends that dollar somewhere else in the city, and then kind of so on and so forth. So we know that we're trying to calculate a multiplier effect. We want to think about the major thing that's going to influence that, and you've probably seen in the past, is this marginal propensity to consume, right? If all of my income, I don't spend any of it in that city, well, then the additional income that that team brought in, it doesn't matter, right? I guess the crazy thought experiment there would be, let's say every single Indianapolis, Pacers player lives in, I don't know, Muncie, and just commutes in, right? So they're spending all of 99.9% of their money somewhere else. Well, then, even though they work in that city, right, their salary will show up as an Indianapolis salary. It's being spent elsewhere, right? So that additional money being brought in isn't going to impact Indianapolis at all. It's going to impact some other city. So kind of the marginal propensity to consume in that city will matter. Sorry, I just described to you not the marginal propensity to consume. I just described to you the marginal propensity to import, right? And so potentially, these players are spending all of their money outside of the city. There's this huge marginal propensity to import, right? Buy things that are outside the city. What will also influence this multiplier is how much money they spend just in general. So even if they purchase everything in Indianapolis, right, but they save 90% of their income, well, then we can't just look at their salary as being, this is all the additional money that's being brought into the city, because it's really only 10% of that. So the way that we'll calculate this multiplier effect, we know that if they consume more, right, their marginal propensity to consume, they're spending a higher percent of their income, that's going to be a better thing for the city. They also know if that marginal propensity to import is lower, right, they're spending more of their money in the city, not outside of it, then that's also going to increase our multiplier effect. So, we end up with this equation for our multiplier effect, which is 1 over 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume, but plus that marginal propensity to import. So we'll kind of think about how this would look for different cities here. And I'll write that equation down again if you were kind of jotting that down. So we've got our multiplier effect, which is 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, plus our marginal propensity to import, right, or spend our money elsewhere. Okay. So what might be true about every dollar that's brought in? So let's think about first, let's do small versus large, right? And maybe we'll think about this as, we'll keep using Indy versus LA. Will be kind of the examples that the two cities that we're using. So what do you think is probably true about the marginal propensity to import for Indianapolis versus the marginal propensity to import for LA? Do you think a player in LA is more likely to spend more of their time and spend more of their money in LA versus a player who's located in Indianapolis? Probably would guess LA, right? We would think probably larger markets, players are more likely to kind of be self-contained in those markets, whereas Indianapolis, maybe they've got a second home, right? Real estate's pretty cheap, so it's a lot easier to afford a home in another area. Potentially, they're just doing a lot more travel. Also, I'm not saying this is a hard and fast rule. I'm just saying we can think about some of these things that might exist, right? We'd have to actually look at player expenditure data, which I'm not aware of players just putting out their financials, so that's a very difficult thing to do. But I would probably guess that the marginal propensity to import is a little bit higher in Indianapolis, right? They're more likely to buy products that are made outside of that city, more likely to spend time outside that city. And so that marginal propensity to import is a little bit higher. So we think about this ratio, right? That multiplier effect in Indy versus LA, which city is probably going to enjoy a larger multiplier effect from spending the same $1 on that player's salaries? $1 on player salaries. Well, if the marginal propensity to import is higher in Indy, what happens to this denominator? It's a little bit, I'm adding a larger value, it's going to be a little bit larger. So if my denominator is larger, what happens to my multiplier effect? It's actually going to be lower, right? So cities where we would expect that marginal propensity to import to be lower, they'd actually end up with a larger multiplier effect there, right? Because more of that money is just going to be churning over within that city, right? The players are more likely to spend it at locations in the city. Those owners are more likely to spend it at other places in the city, and the cycle continues. Right? What if we think about, and I'm not necessarily sure, I'm actually going to just throw this out there. I wasn't sure what example I'd go with. So low versus high salary kind of players. Right? So maybe, I don't know, we think about, what do I want to think about? The marginal propensity to consume for, let's do LeBron James, and the marginal propensity to consume for, I'll pick on Luke Garza right now, just because I heard something about him in the news. Right? So we're thinking about the marginal propensity to consume for like a high salary, high quality player versus a lower, not necessarily quality, we can just think about lower salary player. Right? Which one do you think is likely to have a higher marginal propensity to consume? So we'll do LeBron here versus Luke Garza. Individuals with a higher salary, right? Or maybe think about as a player who's not just a high salary, but going to be in the league a little bit longer, right? They're not going to be as concerned with kind of saving more of that money for the future when they're not in the league, right? Lower quality players or lower salary players, right? Once they're out of the league, more often than not, what do you think probably happens to their salary once they leave the league? Drops dramatically, right? I mean, even if they can get, you know, some of these like Big Ten players who commentate on the Big Ten network, like I doubt they're getting paid that much money, right? And so, you know, it would be, you know, likely that if we looked at kind of the spending habits of players, you know, LeBron can spend 50% of his income, he still has a large chunk of money left, right? Whereas Garza, right, if he spends half of his income, right, he still has to make a much smaller amount last for the rest of his life, right? And so we would probably expect this to be the relationship, which we would think then the multiplier effect for higher quality players like LeBron, right, relative to the multiplier effect for lower kind of salaried players, maybe like a Luke Garza. If you don't know who that is, it's just a backup bench player. He never plays. So that's the kind of the idea of kind of a low versus a high salary. Which multiplier effect is going to be larger? Well, if the marginal propensity to consume is higher, what actually happens to our denominator? Yeah, we're subtracting a larger value. And so we end up with a smaller denominator, which if the denominator is smaller, that multiplier is actually going up. So we can kind of think about these, you know, these are just two examples, small versus large market cities, low versus high salary players. You could think about, and this is, you know, we can make some generalized statements, but right, not every high salary player is going to act this way, but this is generally how we can start to think about, you know, what additional benefits or what extra positive externalities going to exist to a city, is probably dependent on what that city is, like where they are, what the size they are, but also what player they're spending that money on, right? Because different players are going to have different spending habits, which will impact kind of how much the dollars going towards their salary will impact the city versus other players. Is this making sense? Yeah. This guy. So, you know, if you think about LeBron could spend 50%, right? These marginal propensities consumer import, essentially like percentages, but in decimal form, right? So we can think about it as if he spent 50% of his salary, I don't know what's his annual salary close. I think the cap's close to 30 million or something like that. So you'd have what, $15 million left over, right? It's not the greatest consumption smoothing, but that's a large amount of money that you can kind of make last for the rest of your life. Let's say, where is he at? Garza, I don't know what his salary is, probably close to the league minimum. Let's say he even makes 3 million. Well, if he spends 50% of his income, he only has 1.5 million left to kind of extend out, you know, try to consumption smooth across the rest of his life. So it would likely be that the incentive to save is higher when you have a lower income. So if the incentive to save is higher when you have a low income, that's conversely saying the incentive to consume is actually lower for the low salary players. So that we would expect higher salary players, there's not as much of an incentive to save their money. They're more likely to consume or spend more of their money, making their marginal propensity to consume higher. Does that make sense? Any other questions kind of related to this idea? Okay with this? So, we can think about the benefit the city is going to vary wildly, also depending on kind of the types of players those teams have. Right? And I think I had this other example. This is, a very extreme, right? Instead of a high-low salary, you could think about, what about just the money spent on players relative to the money spent on kind of stadium workers, right? Well, there does get a point, right? I think maybe lower salary, you can think about they're going to try or attempt to save more money when it comes to these NBA players. But what potentially would maybe a stadium worker, if I'm just, I don't know, selling hot dogs or something, a vendor, what do you think might be true about their marginal propensity to consume?
They might have to spend more.
They might not have the option to save, right? They literally are just paying their bills or just kind of, meeting up all their bills. And so they don't have any money left over to save. So maybe if the salary is low enough, likely not for low salary in the NBA, but if we're looking at the salaries or the wages of people who are kind of working at the stadium, maybe there you get that their marginal propensity to consume is actually, is as high as you can get. They can't save anything, which would greatly, blow up that multiplier effect, right? If the marginal propensity to consume, it's 1, if you spend everything, this would actually be infinite, right? There's an infinite one. Now you can't literally consume everything, right? There has to be something that you're putting aside and not spending, or that you're spending outside the city, right? So the propensity to consume can never completely be 1 in terms of consuming just in that city, but right, that multiplier effect would get very large, right? So if this new stadium could increase the number of workers in the area from restaurants, bars, hotels, or just working at the stadium, all those workers' salaries are probably going to have a much larger multiplier effect than any of the players' salaries, right? Because players are more likely to have a marginal propensity to save that's a little bit higher. Okay? I know I didn't kind of walk through and draw all that out, but hopefully is that kind of clear why that would be the case, right? They just don't have the opportunity to increase their marginal propensity to save. Yeah.
And was the marginal propensity for import, was that like the example, was Indy being greater, was that LA putting money into Indy or Indy putting money into LA?
So think about it as each dollar a team would spend in Indy versus a dollar that the team spent in LA would have a different impact on that city. So it's not that one city's paying the other. It's just that when they pay their players, it's not just one additional dollar brought to that city, because when that player goes and spends that dollar somewhere in the city, and whoever he pays that dollar to then goes and spends it. And so you kind of have this multiplier effect that's actually bringing in a lot more transactions than just that one additional dollar from that player's salary that was brought in. Is that kind of answer or no?
So it's higher because more of that money is staying in the city rather than going out.
Oh, you mean the marginal propensity to import being higher? Sorry. Yeah, so it would be that we generally think about larger markets. The marginal propensity to import is probably lower because they're not as likely to spend that money outside of the city, right? Think about it, it's kind of weird here to think about imports because it's not necessarily that they're bringing things in the city, it's just that they're spending money outside the city. They're importing goods, right? They're spending, like if you buy something from Canada, you're technically importing a good. Here we're thinking about if I'm a player in LA, I buy something outside of LA, I'm importing a good. Any other questions for keep moving here? Okay. So I think we kind of went over this last class. I jumped ahead a little bit just to kind of look and see what the research says. So a lot of it's that we don't find, too great of effects, but this might likely be because, the cities that these teams locate in, if they weren't there, something else would be. And so we see that in kind of smaller cities. So I think minor league baseball, and then this case study in Columbus, we find that there actually are some pretty significant positive externalities in these cities. Okay. Oops. Then we went through this at the end of last class, kind of thinking a little bit more about like that Seattle where they were voting on whether or not where they're going to build this stadium. How do cities maybe choose where the stadiums go? So, a lot of nostalgic fans, or if we go back and look at early stadiums, a lot of them were built kind of in downtown facilities, or over time ended up being downtown, right? Maybe when they were initially bought, the city wasn't as large, but it kind of grew around the stadium. And now you end up with this stadium kind of being located in downtown, right? So there's benefits to that, to the city, right? Because that's where more of your restaurants, your hotels, you bring more people down to where a lot more of the businesses are, then potentially you get greater positive externalities from this. Right? But you would also get additional negative externalities from this as well, right? If the stadium's located in downtown, well, then when everyone's coming in to watch a game, you get a lot more traffic, you get a lot more individuals, like we kind of talked about earlier, all those possible negative externalities. So you would think this might be where positive externalities are maximized. Oops. But when we look at a lot of the newer stadiums, they haven't been as successful downtown, like in the downtown location. So, if we think about why, when teams try to do this now, why it doesn't work, but it has in the past, well, because when these stadiums were originally built, they weren't downtown. The cities grew around them. And so we see a lot more of these newer stadiums is being built out in kind of the outskirts or in the suburbs. In fact, what was Atlanta's, I'm not even sure it's technically in Atlanta. It's so far out away from the city. It's like almost in one of the suburbs, their new stadium that the Braves built. I think, where's San Francisco Stadium isn't technically in San Francisco, I think, if you actually look at like the actual address of it, right? It's not in a completely different area, but it's really part of the metro, right? So you might see a lot of these newer stadiums are starting to locate kind of outside of the downtown area, right? So what would the benefits be to that? Well, really, you can reduce travel costs if a lot of your populace that is going to the games are people that have higher incomes or maybe living in the suburbs, then a lot of your fans might be commuting in. So if you have a city, I'll use this city as an example, except a little anecdotal evidence, but like Detroit, right? Their old like baseball stadium stuff was just in the worst area of town. I mean, not a area that you really want to be at, when it's dark and when there's no cops out, right? And so what they decided when they built their new stadium is we're going to build this not directly downtown, but kind of right on like the outskirts, right? So they kind of built this new kind of on the outskirts of Detroit is where they started locating all their stadiums, right? And so now if you're closer to the individuals who are commuting in to go to the game to begin with, then maybe you can actually increase revenues there, right? Because you've reduced the cost of people to attending the game. Now, this might not be the case in every city, right? It kind of depends on the city decay. If the city decay is not downtown, it's other areas, then you might be okay going downtown. But a lot of teams have kind of realized that you don't necessarily have to be located in the heart of the city, kind of being on the outskirts, especially if you look at your kind of demographics of your consumers, and a lot more of them are coming from the suburbs or outside the city, then it actually makes sense to locate out there. Let's also think about how locating in the city might greatly increase my costs. What's probably true about real estate in downtown Chicago versus, I don't know, go 30, 40 minutes outside of Chicago. It's a lot more expensive, right? So if I not only need to get land to build a stadium, but I need parking, maybe I want to add in some additional, like all of them sometimes will have a shop across from the stadium or they own that as well. I'm just going to need more land. It's going to become increasingly expensive. So that might be another reason, right? I can kind of cost cut a little bit by not locating directly downtown in one of these kind of historically large cities. And now there's a lot of like subjectiveness to this in terms of like looking at different cities. It's all going to be a little bit different, but this is what we can kind of think about. So I did mention this paper last class, but I wanted to kind of think a little bit harder about how they would actually estimate the effects of a new city a new stadium or a new team locating within the city, right? So that minor league baseball paper, right? Essentially what they're kind of concerned with are these different economic indicators for the county or I think here they don't just look at county, they get all the way down to what we call a micropolitan statistical area, right? So there's also, actually, I can't remember exactly, did they do micropolitan or the metropolitan? I guess I don't specifically have it. Maybe it's, well, regardless, the idea is the same, right? They're trying to get a geographical location of where these teams are located. So whether or not you're looking at the city or you're looking at kind of just that metro area, we can see, is there a change in that per capita income? I could also, instead of using per capita income as my left-hand side, my dependent or my Y variable, what might be another thing I could look at that maybe we've already mentioned here today? So maybe not just the income going up in the area. If I'm bringing in additional jobs, I might expect the unemployment rate to be lower as well. So I could use kind of per capita income, unemployment rates here is my Y variable. Any of these economic conditions that I believe might change as a result of having that new stadium there. You know, I then want to control for, you know, they throw in kind of this X is just a bunch of different things they can control for. So they control for things like the demographics of the city, maybe like income kind of distribution measures that they have. They can look at previous per capita income. You can look at a wide variety of different, you can look at what region of the country, what weather patterns are like. You can include whatever controls there you want. And then Z is going to be really the variables that they were interested in, which is typically just a 1-0 for whether or not there was a new stadium in that city. And not just new stadium, but in the case of minor league baseball, did they have, was this a year they had a team in the city, right? Because there's kind of a lot of kind of changes there for the data. Okay. We then have these things that we call fixed effects, and I kind of described these before, like maybe I want to control, if I'm thinking about the ticket market, I want to control for the day of the week that the ticket is. So I just create an indicator 1-0 for whether or not it was on Monday, 1, or if it wasn't on a Monday, 0. And I create another identifier, 1 if it was a Tuesday, 0 if not. I can then throw those, you know, do one for every single day. I'll leave one day out to be my base or my kind of comparison group, and then include all those other indicators. We would call that fixed effects. I now can find the effect of, just for example, if I'm doing that, right? So if I've got, I guess, ticket revenue, and I think it's a function of, I don't know, day of the week. And maybe here I leave out, I'll just go up to whatever this would be, 6. And I'll do Saturday. So I'll leave out Sunday. So relative to a Sunday game, a Monday game, we would expect beta 1 higher ticket revenue. Relative to a Sunday game, we would expect beta 2, whatever that coefficient is, higher ticket revenue on a Tuesday, and then kind of so on and so forth. So this is the idea of fixed effects. You could do this not only for the day of the week, but what they do here is actually include fixed effects for what metropolitan area they're looking at. Right? So they're saying, you know, we're controlling, well, if we look at the same city, control for all these other factors that exist in the city, but one of those cities, like it's almost like you're looking at the same city, even though you can't really in reality do this, but one of them gets a new stadium or a new team, the other doesn't. What's the additional kind of increase in their economic conditions that we see, specifically here per capita income? Any questions on anything there? I'm trying to kind of give us a little bit more, you know, throw in more regressions, thinking about how we can kind of use these coefficients or how we can at least interpret them, right? So when it comes to this Z variable, I believe what they ended up doing was just a 1 if it's a new franchise, or 1 if there's a franchise in the city, 0 if not. So this coefficient beta 2 will tell us the additional increase or decrease in per capita income that exists when you have one of these minor league teams in your city. Okay. Now they get a little bit more specific. It's not just a minor league team. They say, you know, do you have a AAA franchise, a AA franchise, or a single A? And then I forget what the kind of different classification here is, but it's the kind of same idea. You're just looking at different levels of minor leagues. I kind of noticed when they looked at the number of professional franchises, here they're using stars to notate kind of traditionally, you know, 3 stars, significant at the 99% level, 2 stars, 95, 1 star, 90. So we don't see any significance, or we can't say that any of these estimates are anything different from 0. Remember, the idea when we get these stars, it's that the p-value has gotten low enough that we can reject the null, where the null, we always start out assuming that no matter what coefficient we're looking at, we always assume it's equal to 0. So if we can get a low enough p-value, we can reject this and say, no, there actually is an effect, right? But we always start out stacking the deck against ourselves, assuming there's no effect. So when we look at the professional sport coefficients, nothing's significant here. Now, generally they look like they're, NFL is actually negative, which is kind of weird, but right, the standard error is so large, these p-values are like 0.99, right? These are indistinguishable from the value of 0. However, when we look at these AAA and in a couple specifications, it looks like the AA teams as well, we see that having a AAA or AA franchise in your city actually does increase per capita income And it's only what, $65, $75, right? But if that's per capita, that's per person, take that, multiply it by the number of people in the area, that could be a substantial amount of money. Right? So this was kind of that paper that I had mentioned. I thought kind of the results were interesting here. And they run a couple different models. So they kind of do this for AAA only, AA, and like I said, kind of identified like different variations in minor league. And they find that typically AAA, AA teams, I think it was having a new stadium or having a stadium in the city was kind of good. They found, 2 areas where they actually found an effect. And then AAA, and then this A+, they found just having a team in the area, not even necessarily a new stadium, we actually see a positive effect there. So kind of interesting, I guess, results there. And maybe sometimes we need to think a little bit more about the non-professional leagues here could actually be benefiting cities. So one thing that I didn't quite get to last class that I wanted to go over is a term, and I don't have this term in the slides, and if I reference it, I will, let me see if this helps. If I ever like put something on the exam, I would kind of use the terminology or kind of describe it as well. But the idea would be what we call kind of log rolling. So let's think about, let's say, and this is like oversimplifying it. So let's say this is the West, Central, and East. We're thinking about there's 3 regions or 3 areas in a city. We could make this more complicated, kind of like the Seattle one, where you really have like a long list of districts, right? You then think about, okay, here's proposal 1, and here's proposal 2. So proposal 1 is for the kind of a new stadium to be built in the west side of the city. So maybe let's think about Chicago here. And so, I don't know, 10 million. If the West gets that stadium built in the West, it greatly benefits them. Right? So they see this additional increase in kind of, I guess, we think about this as not just revenue, but like increase in revenue minus cost. Right? However, the Central and the East, the stadium's not located in their area, so they don't get to enjoy any of the positive externalities. It just costs them in terms of paying for it in tax dollars. Or maybe there's some negative externalities there as well. Proposition 2 is the exact same thing, but the East is proposing to put a stadium there. Yeah.
What state is this?
What state?
Yeah, or like.
So just think of this as a city, and we're just kind of breaking this down. Okay. We're simplifying.
An example of like a city.
No, so you could think of any city, and like I said with Seattle, like we had that map. There's I don't know how many districts, right? So you could actually have like every single district here, right? And every single district's benefits, or really benefits minus cost, their additional profits here. You would just have a much longer list of districts. So think if we could just simplify it down to there was 3 districts, right? One in the West, the Central, and the East. It's almost like if I had a city and I like took it into thirds, right? Okay. So each of these locations would like a stadium in their area. So maybe the proposal 1 is the West wants to bring in an NBA team, and proposal 2 is, I don't know, the East wants to bring in an NFL team, right? So if this is a scenario, if they vote on these individually, what's going to be the voting outcome to proposal 1? Well, the West is going to like it, but the Central and the East, I mean, they're going to be worse off, right? Negative $2 million, so they're going to vote no. So fails. What about proposal 2? Same kind of idea. One of these regions would vote for it, 2 wouldn't, and so it fails. Log rolling is the idea that if we can somehow combine our proposals, that we can both get what we want. So let's say under kind of this log roll proposal, so they combine both of these propositions together. And so now people are going to be voting on whether or not we build both of these stadiums. Well, now, right, the stadium being built in the West benefits them 10 million, but there's now a stadium being built in the East as well. So they're going to lose 2 million from that. But net, they're still positive. Right? Same kind of idea for the East. They get their, this proposal, this log roll proposal where they combine both of the proposals together. They're going to get the stadium they want, but they're going to have the additional costs from the West also getting their stadium. The Central just gets out of wood. Yeah, they get screwed, right? And so there's no real benefit. They don't like this log roll proposal. But notice what happens. If the parties that could benefit from these different proposals come together and log roll them all together, what's the vote here? Yeah, right. 2 out of the 3 parties vote yes, and this log rolled proposal will pass. This is really like basic. This is basic politics. I mean, in the sense of like when they were like, you read some of these bills and they're like, you've got a bill about infrastructure, and all of a sudden at some point you're like, why is there also something in here about money going to some endangered species in Arkansas or something? Like they just roll in these additional proposals because one side knows, well, if I throw this in, that party is more likely to also vote for this kind of log roll proposal. The same sort of thing could originate kind of at the local politics level as well. And that would be, this is just kind of a toy example of how, voting or combining multiple proposals can sometimes get something to occur that running them individually you couldn't. And really for the city, is this a net positive? Well, I mean, if these are built, I mean, you can easily see what the net positive here is 16 minus 4. So that city is going to bring in a whole lot of additional revenue, right? If they can log roll these proposals. If they don't, they get 0, right? There's nothing's built. Okay. Does this make sense? And this is really just because if we have incentives that don't align, well, then we need to ensure that, we have some sort of agreement where, yeah, we're going to lose out a little bit by log rolling, right? The West and the East are, they're hurt a little bit, but they benefit a lot relative to what they know is going to happen if they don't, which is that they don't get their stadium, right? Just 0. Right? So if it's we have kind of incentives that don't align, sometimes log rolling can help actually improve surplus, which we generally think about it as a bad thing, right? But it can be positive for the city. Okay, not positive for the people that live in the central part of the city, but for the city overall, right? So that's why I left that slide blank. We'll kind of go through this relatively quick. There's a model I want to kind of work through and think about when it comes to, I guess, bidding for these large events. So we think about things like the Super Bowl, the World Cup, the Olympics. The Super Bowl is a little bit less, right? There's actually a schedule to who gets it. But if you think about things like the World Cup and the Olympics, people are bidding to kind of host these events. Now, we don't see as many cities bidding to host them recently. And the reason why is because if we kind of look at what the benefits to the city are, it actually looks like it probably isn't a net positive when it comes to hosting some of these larger events. Now, it can be, but not always. So if we think about the Super Bowl specifically, there have been kind of some reports out there, you can like Google and probably find numbers similar to this, that, the cities that have the Super Bowl bring in additional $720 million, right? Sorry, that's like the highest, whereas most of them, it's like on average, they bring in about 300 million, right? So costs are not really that high. So like if this is revenue, you might as well just think about this as profit, because if you look at the revenues to hosting, you already usually have the infrastructure. So it's really just the additional cost of I don't know, police and kind of ensuring that you have some additional amenities and everything's ready to go. And so like, if you look at some of the costs, like some of them are reported as low as $10 million. So, I mean, huge profits it looks like to be made here, right? However, if we looked at some research that's been done on this, and this is a little bit older of data, but I've seen some people do some things similar. Someone just did something a couple of years ago with the Colts and looked at the impacts on the Indianapolis hotel industry when they hosted the Super Bowl in Indianapolis. And they did find kind of gains similar that would have been on the kind of line with this. And so these two economists found that the average impact was not 300 million, but only about 30. Right? So why did they, how are they getting so far up by like a factor of 10 here, right? Well, so they find this positive effect, right? And specifically, they find it on also per capita income, right? So they think that's really where a lot of this additional revenue is coming from, right? So why does the NFL, who's putting out, and I think I have my things out of order here, but why does the NFL, who thinks, was putting numbers out in the hundreds of millions, why don't they agree with these economists who come up with an estimate of closer to like 30 million, right? Well, the idea is, if you just look at the revenue generated on the weekend of the Super Bowl in that city, it likely is very, very high. However, if the Super Bowl wasn't there, what do you think is probably also true about all the revenue generated in that city on a typical weekend? It's a very large city. It's probably also very high. People come to cities all the time for non-sports related events, right? Like if New York didn't have a sports team, I'm sure the city would be doing just fine, right? And so we don't really want to just look at raw revenue numbers. You really want to look at, well, what's the additional revenue relative to just kind of a normal weekend, right? And so what they did, I believe, was it Bade and Matheson? But this really kind of cool thing where they looked at the change in revenue from the year prior on the exact same weekend, right? So like they went back a year, the date would be close. They obviously might have to move it up a day or a couple of days to make sure they're comparing weekends at the similar time. And then it's okay, what was the change in revenue from the year before they hosted the Super Bowl? And that's going to give you a much cleaner kind of estimate of the additional revenue that Super Bowl is generating. And that's really why they see such a lower amount. Right? So a lot of times when we're thinking about these additional impacts or these externalities, we can't just, when you're looking at the data, you can't just look at the raw numbers of revenue. You need to think about, well, what was the additional, what was the marginal revenue of having the Super Bowl here? And then you need a comparison group. Pretty good comparison group would be the year prior. Now, it's not perfect, right? Or you could use another comparison group would be, well, what's a similar, let's control for size and try to get a city that's of similar size, similar demographics, and kind of compare their revenue to what the city's revenue was with the Super Bowl. And the difference there being the additional revenue generated. Any questions on this before we keep going here? So, the Super Bowl, I said, is a little bit different because people aren't necessarily bidding for it year after year. It's usually a set location, like teams think of it as a positive thing. And so they want to be on the list to host the Super Bowl, right? And to be fair, the league kind of determines who that is. However, when it comes to the Olympics, right, or I think the World Cup is a very similar way, we actually see teams or cities bidding to host this event, thinking that it's going to bring these huge additional, profits to the city. So when we actually look at the costs and revenues of Olympic Games, I mean, the costs are huge. Like, unless, you're using an old, Olympic Games facility, right, or you can use some of your pre-existing stadiums, I mean, there's a lot of money that has to be put into building the infrastructure for an Olympic Games. Like, I think you could probably Google the numbers, but like the Olympics that was just in China, like it was ridiculous how much money they spent just to kind of set up the, every single stadium, every single facility they needed to host every single event. Right? And so there's a huge cost. Right? So the same kind of two economists, they looked at what was this, hotels. So they had sales data from restaurants, hotels, and then they had some general merchandise, other like they were looking at some type of data set that had every store. And so if you were in a hotel or a restaurant, they kind of called you general merchandiser, right? These could be a variety of different things. And they also looked at unemployment or employment numbers. Right? And so what they found was that sales at restaurants and hotels went up, general merchandise kind of went down, and that employment did go up the year the Olympics existed, but no long-term impact. And I think this is intuitive in the sense of when they're hosting these events, they need a lot of people to help work a variety of different things, whether or not it's even down to like security or something like that. And so we might see employment higher that year, or maybe even that year prior, preparing for the Olympic Games. But once the games are over, those jobs don't exist anymore, right? So right away, we kind of see things go right back to where they were before. Now, when it comes to hotels, right, what's the difference here between hotels and restaurants versus kind of general merchandise stores? Maybe think of this as like a clothing store. Why do you think we actually see clothing stores see lower revenues while that Super Bowl is being hosted? Or Super Bowl, the Olympics, sorry.
I was gonna say Olympic merchandise.
So don't think of this as just Olympic merchandise. Think about this as the existing companies or stores in the area. So this could be a area, I don't know, name Walmart, right? Anywhere, right? Anywhere that has kind of taxable items that isn't a restaurant or a hotel.
So people much rather want to watch the Olympics than buy a shirt.
People aren't there to shop for one. Also, if I live in the area and now there's all these people coming in to watch the Olympics, maybe what am I more likely to do? Avoid that area, right? If I'm not wanting to go watch the Olympics as well, right, I may be less likely to go down to whatever, merchandiser in that area. Even if it's a Walmart, I might travel a little bit further somewhere else because I actually won't be traveling farther because there'll be less traffic, or, so we might see that when it comes to things that would have been bought without the Olympics, maybe they actually see those be a little bit lower when we host the Olympics. Now, hotels and restaurants make sense. People are coming in from out of the area. They need somewhere to stay. They need somewhere to eat. It's not as likely they can kind of purchase food to kind of make for themselves while there. And so I think this is a fairly intuitive results there. So when you look at the actual revenues expenses, a lot of these cities lose money on hosting the Olympics. Right? And so this is a problem. Like I think if you look at the number of cities that propose to host it, it continually is just decreasing over time. Right? Cities have realized this isn't good. So what's one way that you could reduce costs, right, or boost revenues? Well, a couple of proposals have been out there. For one, what cities can lower their costs the most? If the infrastructure is the largest expense, cities like LA or somewhere that already have several large stadiums, right, and already have several sports teams, a variety of different types of sports, might be a way they can kind of reduce costs, right? They don't have to build completely new infrastructure. Right? Excuse me. One thing that has been proposed as well is, let's say I'm hosting any event, right? Let's say I'm trying to run, I don't know, a high school track meet or something. The first time I go to run that event, I have no idea. I'll probably forget, or I won't know of half a dozen things that I should have been thinking about. But then when I go run it the second time, I remember, oh yeah, like there is that one area of the gate that's open. People are just gonna like walk back around, try to avoid paying for tickets, right? There's just things that I'm learning from doing. Once I host the events once, I can be more efficient the second time I host it. So one of the proposals that's been put out there that would boost revenues and decrease costs, right? It would improve this learning by doing, also reduce infrastructure costs, is to really come up with a small batch of cities and then cycle through them. Kind of like in the NFL. And I haven't seen anybody do this, but it'd be interesting to look at what's happening, what are the additional benefits that the Super Bowl brought into a city. And we have enough time, a long enough time period now where you can actually have repeat cities, right? And see, like, did they do better the second time the Super Bowl came to that? But that's kind of the idea. That's the proposal, right? You get a smaller batch, so you get more repeaters. So they're learning by doing every time they host it. They're also reducing the infrastructure costs because once they host it the first time, all that stuff is there the second time as well. I think I mentioned that. So any questions on that before we keep moving? So once these teams, want to locate in a city or they want to build a new stadium, how do these stadiums get paid for? So it's kind of interesting. A lot of the times it's not completely from the team themselves, right? A lot of the times the city will subsidize that stadium or give that team money, okay, to build a stadium there. So these teams are going to bid, like if a team is thinking about relocating, a lot of cities will like come together and put up like bids for it. Well, our city will subsidize you this much. And our city will subsidize you this much, right? Trying to compete with each other in terms of these bids. So when demand is really high, right, and you don't have a lot of teams, right, then, the teams have all the power, right? But once you have a high number of teams, if you got, a large enough or a small number of cities that want you, well, now the kind of balance is swinging the other way, right? You're competing with a lot of other teams to try to relocate in a small number of cities. So, I already kind of mentioned this about kind of they propose these different subsidies. So if I want to limit the number of teams, let's say that we thought about the optimal league size like we were before. If I want to keep my monopoly power as a league, I might limit the number of teams to ensure that's going to occur. Because the more teams that I introduce, right, the value of each team goes down and the price that these cities will be willing to pay or the subsidies they're willing to offer will also go down. So I would like to kind of limit the number of teams to ensure that I as a league have kind of the most power in this interaction. Okay? So once a team commits to a city, the problem is, what does that city essentially have over them, right? They know that, you know, once you've committed, once you're in my city, it's very costly for you to leave, right? And so now, once you locate in that city, teams realize that city is immediately going to have more of the power, right? Because now it's kind of an empty threat if I threaten to leave. Like, let's say, you know, the Rams, or I don't know, maybe that's a bad example. Let's say, let's say the Dallas Cowboys threaten Dallas. They say, look, we want to build a new stadium. The last time they built it, and if you don't want to subsidize any of it, we can find a city that does. Dallas is probably going to turn around and go, your entire fan base is directly tied to the fact that you are the Dallas Cowboys, right? So if you try to leave, we know this is an empty threat, right? You cannot find revenues as high as you can in Dallas as the Dallas Cowboys. Right? So once they locate in a city, it becomes very difficult for teams to move, right? Unless they're in a smaller city, and then somehow they can find a different market that offers higher revenues where, yeah, it'll be costly to move, but the additional revenues that can be made in these other locations is enough to compensate for them. Okay, so we see once a team is located in an area, it's unlikely that they really leave that location unless another city can offer extremely high subsidy values, or other cities are exploding in population or exploding in income and then can provide additional revenues they couldn't have in the past. Okay? So we might see some shifts over time, you know, cities or teams moving to different cities. But in terms of like the large markets, I can't think, you know, it's very unlikely we would see teams leave large markets unless a city that they're located in says, we're going to give you 0 subsidies, and they can find some other city that says, we'll pay for 100% for the stadium, right? Or something, you know, along those lines, maybe not that extreme, but along those lines. So I'm going to come back to this because I know I have some data that kind of lines up with this that we'll go ahead on. So I've already been mentioning these subsidies. So we can look at the different leagues, and this is a little bit older of data. I think it was, I forget what year this paper was, but you can kind of see, you know, at least it has all the new stadiums built prior to 2011. And it then kind of comes up with the public percent. So this is the percent of the stadium that the city paid for or that was subsidized by the city. So first of all, before I look at the numbers, kind of relating to what we talked about last class, if I'm thinking about a market and I've got, think about the number of kind of games being played here. So I've got my demand curve, supply curve. Right? And we think about if there existed positive externalities. So if there existed positive externalities, actually, before we do that, I'm going to call this the original, right? Without any externalities, I think about this as Q1 and P1. And that's where we start out. However, if there's externalities, where would society like to be? Well, the marginal social benefit at every number of games will be higher. Right? There's a positive externality to these games being played. So society would really like, we'll call this QS, I guess, for society. Society would really like a higher number of games to be played. Or there's this positive externality to the number of games. Now, obviously, like the schedules are what they are. The same number of games are going to be played, but you could, so if you want to, you could think about it as maybe there's too few games being played, but it's really that even if we kept playing the same number of games, right, we should be able, you know, this should have a much, you know, this reflects kind of marginal social benefits. I guess think about it here. This number of games is being played. There's actually a much larger benefit to society. Right? There's these additional positive externalities. So how could I potentially make sure that when teams are deciding or leagues are deciding the number of games or the number of teams that they want to put in that city, how can I ensure that I get to this socially efficient point? So the positive externality there, you can think about, we said marginal social benefit was equal to the marginal benefit to the consumers in that market plus this external benefit. So how can I get people involved in this market to operate not off of the demand curve, not off their own private marginal benefits, but operate based off of this marginal social benefit? Well, I can essentially, if I can get a pretty good estimate on the external benefit, if that's the amount of the subsidy that I give them, well, that would just shift my demand curve until it matches right up with that marginal social benefit curve. So ideally, if I can set a subsidy exactly equal to those positive externalities, I can force people, the consumers in this market, the demand curve will shift out to match the society's kind of total benefits there. So I can use subsidies, right? This is why it makes sense for the cities. They know there's positive externalities, or at least they believe they are. And so they're willing to subsidize and build this state. Now, this is kind of a weird one. We looked at number of games there last class, and that's why I drew it this way. It's actually like a really, it's kind of a complicated thing, right? In that it's actually like a 1-0, so it's kind of hard to visualize, but I either build a stadium or I don't, right? And probably it's the case that like demand is way down here for the private individuals in the market, and so no one's going to build the stadium themselves, right? There's the consumers are involved in this market. We would actually end up with an equilibrium quantity of 0. However, there's positive externalities to society. If we can force that demand curve up enough with subsidies, then at some point, right, it's going to cross over to where we get one stadium built. So it's a little bit of a weird one because it's really just, is it built or is it not, instead of like something continuous like the number of games. But the same sort of principles would apply. And we actually want to use subsidies to get to that socially efficient quantity of stadiums would be the only difference there. So when we look at what cities have decided that they want to do this, I mean, notice these two teams in New York. Well, first of all, they're splitting the stadium. So like they can split the cost, but New York gave them no money. Why do you think New York didn't give them any money? What's going to happen if the New York Giants try to relocate? It's going to be very costly. They're going to lose a lot of their fan base. They probably know, New York knows also New York is like one of the largest markets. So they know this is not a credible threat for them to leave. So they didn't have to offer any subsidies. So if you want to build a new stadium, like we know you're going to build it in New York, so go ahead, right? We're not going to give you any money for that. You might see what are some other lower percentages. It looks like Carolina's is kind of low. And none of these are extremely low. Dallas's was pretty low. That one kind of makes sense. Well, as when you see maybe some smaller markets like Kansas City, New Orleans, Indianapolis. Notice Indianapolis subsidized the entire worth of the stadium. And there's a lot of different areas like that, Cincinnati, right? And so we see a lot of variation across teams, and that's likely dependent on market size. And also, like, are there other cities kind of proposing for bids, right? I don't know, for each one of these, maybe some years there was certain cities that were also kind of putting competing bids, but others maybe there weren't. And so that would influence like how much competition there was from other cities as well. So it's hard to say since this varies across time, but at least we can see there's quite a bit of variation. Notice like New England also, they know that they're probably not going to leave Boston, and so that they didn't subsidize very much either. Now we see a couple 100% here in the NFL, and the average is 61%. When we go to the Major League Baseball, the average is a little bit lower. You probably see not quite as many 100%, right? Maybe the cities don't believe that the Major League Baseball teams will bring in as much additional revenue as maybe the NFL, and so maybe that's why we see a little bit lower of an average. But we see variation here, similar kind of idea. New York's not putting up a whole lot of money for New York baseball teams' new stadiums. While smaller markets like Tampa, right, 100%. Chicago, I'm surprised was 100%, but I think that's likely if you think about where the location of that stadium is, and they're already existing a current team, maybe the threat there is that they just continue to move a little bit further outside of Chicago. All right, so each one would be a little bit different, but it's kind of interesting to look at some of these numbers, see the variation that exists. Oh, I had some Major League Soccer. This one was interesting to me because you see a couple more zeros in here. There's smaller cities, and so it's just to me it must be that there's not as much competition for like cities trying to get a Major League Soccer team to locate there. I had NBA. You see a few more zeros there. Kind of some of your larger markets, which is kind of interesting. Not a whole lot more to say about this, but these are some interesting numbers that you can kind of take a look at. So we're trying to subsidize these cities, right? But how are we going to pay for this? Okay. So how are they going to raise the funds essentially? So we can raise them through taxes is going to be the main way. And the goal is that we want to set efficient taxes, right? So if I tax something that's very sensitive to price, so let's say, let's say, what are those like little packs of gum? They're like 30 or 35 cents now. It used to be a quarter. You got like 5 sticks of gum, right? You can buy them when you're at the front of any grocery store. Let's say they put a $10 tax in those. What do you think? How many of those packs of gum do you think are going to be purchased? 0, right? That is an insanely high tax on an item like that. And so setting a $10 tax there generates no additional tax revenue because now nothing's bought. But if I put a $10 tax on automobiles, nobody bats an eye, right? Everyone's going to pay that. It's not going to change anyone's decision if the price of their automobile just went up by $10, right? And so the goal is, how can I set efficient taxes? Or what goods should I tax so that I can maximize total revenue? And we'll also talk about not just how can I maximize revenue, but I also might want to start thinking about kind of fairness, right? This is not something we maybe always talk about in economics, but it's worthwhile. Right? So we want to make sure that it's efficient for our society. And so where can I maximize revenue while minimizing my deadweight loss? Okay. So the size of the tax will be related to the elasticity. So I'll kind of draw a very toy example. And yes, slope is not quite the same as elasticity, but they are correlated. So I'm going to just kind of use slope to talk about elasticity here to simplify it a bit. So let's say I've got, and I kind of want to draw these next to each other. So I'll probably have to move this a little bit, but it'll be all right. Let's say I've got a really steep demand curve. And I don't know, here's my supply curve. Okay. Here's my demand. If I tax this good, I think about that's going to shift my supply curve here or decrease my supply curve. The new equilibrium quantity will be here. And the deadweight loss is really all the surplus lost from the units I didn't sell after the tax that I would have sold if there was no tax, right? That was kind of our deadweight loss there. So we'll call this deadweight loss 1. It goes with demand curve 1. I'll try to draw this as best as I can here. So if the same value of the tax was imposed, and just for the thought experiment, and to kind of put this in the same graph to really make a point, let's say I have another demand curve facing the same supply and the same amount of a tax, so it's the same shift in supply. Now, if I think about where's my deadweight loss, well, it would have been of my no tax quantity here, my tax quantity here. This entire area is my deadweight loss. And so you kind of see, like, as people are becoming more coming, the way I do this is not going to work. It's kind of hard because I don't have actually numbers here. I'm going to try drawing something a little bit different here. Let's think about, so I really want to make this point. So let's do like an egregious demand curve here. I'm going to think about supply plus the tax, and here's my supply. So kind of here's my deadweight loss. What if I had a demand curve that was perfectly inelastic, right? So we would call kind of this vertical demand curve perfectly inelastic in the sense that no matter what the price is, no matter what the change in the price is, I'm demanding the exact same amount. I'm not responding at all to these price changes. In that scenario, what's my deadweight loss? Well, after the tax, right, I can think about where does the demand curve hit my supply curve. It's going to be at the exact same point. There's actually no deadweight loss there, right? So as I get a more inelastic demand curve, my deadweight loss is going to 0, right? So I really want to tax inelastic goods. And this makes sense. If I'm taxing something, if I'm changing the price of something that people won't respond to that price change, they'll keep buying the same amount. Well, then I can generate a lot of additional revenue. I didn't lose, there's no deadweight loss. However much the tax is, it's just that much times whatever quantity is being purchased. Now, if I have a very elastic demand curve or a more elastic demand curve, I know that that tax is going to increase the price and people are going to buy less, which is what's causing that kind of deadweight loss. So if I looked at elastic goods, those would be ones where I can't generate as much revenue because that same value of the tax, well, I know that the quantity purchase is going to go down, right? Whereas if it was perfectly inelastic, quantity stays the same, I can make more revenue off the same kind of tax increase there. Probably should have started out kind of thinking about the perfect inelastic point to really make this clear. So I want to tax really inelastic goods, goods that people aren't responding to price changes in. And so if you think about things like hotels, right, people are somewhat sensitive to the price of hotels, and maybe I think about kind of restaurant food or something. However, if I'm thinking about the good I always use for perfectly inelastic is going to be insulin, right? Because you have to buy it. Doesn't matter what the price is. That's why we get upset when we see things like EpiPens or insulin, like the price get jacked up on because like that person has to buy the same quantity of insulin no matter what, right? So that would be a very good, we would want to tax in terms of efficiency. But it seems pretty unfair, right? To like tax insulin a bunch just because we know that people are going to pay it. But it would be a very efficient tax, right? So we don't only want to maximize efficiency, right? Reduce deadweight loss. We also want to make sure that we're being equitable, right? Or that we're being fair to people. And so the two kind of types of equity we'll talk about are vertical and horizontal. So vertical equity is going to be one that we're probably a little bit familiar with, or at least the idea, which is that people have a higher ability to pay or higher incomes are going to be taxed more, right? So this is the idea of the income tax. If you earn a higher income, you end up in a higher bracket, you pay a higher percentage tax on the income. That's the idea of vertical equity. People have the ability to pay the most, will pay the most. So property taxes are another really good example of this. Most things, if we think about vertical equity, in relation to like, you want to think about tickets, maybe if there was like an additional tax imposed upon luxury box tickets or something, that would be the idea of a vertical tax or vertical equity with taxes. Horizontal equity is really when it comes to these sport examples, when we think about who we should tax to pay for a stadium, probably the one that we're a little bit more concerned about. So horizontal equity would be that whoever benefits from this public good that we're trying to pay for, whoever benefits the most, we should tax them the most. So when it comes to building new stadiums, what do you think are some really popular taxes? I think I mentioned the study earlier, the guy was looking at hotels. And that's a really good example because you bring in a lot of people who attend these games who are coming from somewhere else, they need somewhere to stay, right? So if I put a tax on hotels, I know it's less likely I'm taxing my citizens, like people who may not even be going to the game, but more likely I am taxing people coming from out of town who are here to attend the game. Yeah.
Parking meters.
Parking meters would be a good one in the sense of, well, I would maybe argue that actually would be the opposite of horizontal equity, right? Because maybe if you want to argue parking meters near the stadium, I think that I'm with you. But just parking meters, right? If people are traveling in and maybe they're flying, what are they not likely to have? Their car, right? So maybe it would be, but I understand where you're coming from because you're thinking people who are going to park near the stadium or something along those lines, like they would be the ones paying that tax. And so what we're trying to do with vertical equity is target the people who are more likely to be using the stadium with that tax. So hotels are a really popular one. Additional taxes on, actually, this is like a little bit where we get away from sports and it's just like leisure in general. But does anyone know the town? There's a Six Flags up near Chicago, but it's like a specific, is it Gurney Mill or Gurney, whatever the city's actual name is. They did this thing where they somehow agreed with Six Flags, it's like it's part of the town, but they tax it different. And so if you buy something in that town, it's just whatever the sales tax is in Illinois. But if you buy it within Six Flags, it's like 15% sales tax, right? And so that's a very good example of a vertical equity tax, because the only person paying that 15% tax are people in Six Flags actually using that facility, right? So the idea would be if I could have like a stadium specific tax, right? That would be perfect vertical equity. If like there was a tax on stadium concession sales, perfect vertical equity. Now it's unlikely we usually can get perfect vertical equity, but we can do things like tax things that are near the stadium. So maybe you redistrict it, or maybe you just put hotel taxes or additional taxes on restaurants because you think that people maybe using some of these restaurants are more likely to be there for the game. Trying to think of another good example here where we could think about vertical equity, or sorry, not vertical, horizontal equity. So one thing you wouldn't want to do with horizontal equity is, let's think of something that people would use who are coming to a stadium. So like if you're going to Chicago, maybe you're more likely to use public transportation to get to the stadium, right? And so the city thinks that we can tax public transportation, right? Well, the problem is, yes, people are more likely, that would be maybe horizontally equitable, but people using public transportation who live in the city are more likely to have lower incomes than maybe someone who's not using public transportation. Right? It's very expensive to have a car and a park it and everything in the city. And so maybe it would be a little bit horizontally equitable, but it wouldn't be vertically equitable. And there's a lot of things where it's really a trade-off between the two. Right? But this is something we can at least start kind of thinking about. Any tax that is imposed, what are the vertical equity implications of it, and what are the horizontal equity implications of it? I think here, where are we on time? A couple minutes left. We'll kind of go through this and then I'll kind of end here. Oh, I didn't even go over the, ran out of time because I wasn't paying attention at the time. All right, so what do I want to do here? We'll kind of end it here. We'll kind of come back. I'll restructure these slides a little bit for Monday. The paper that we're going to talk about today, since I wasn't paying attention to the clock enough, we'll talk about that on Tuesday. I'll kind of restructure whatever slides we have left here in the order I want to go, and I'll kind of repost them. We'll go through those on Tuesday, but we'll likely have a pretty big chunk of time where we can do some review. So these questions here, where were they at? Here they go. These are like some sample questions. It looks similar to some of the homework 2 questions, but we'll work through them. They have slightly different wrinkles in them that the ones on the homework didn't. And we'll do a little bit of kind of going over some of those practice problems that I posted on Tuesday as well, trying to get us ready for that exam on Thursday. Okay, so your homework is due by the end of the day today. If you want to turn it in a hard copy on your way out, just turn it up here. Otherwise, upload it by the end of the day. I'll try to get those graded as soon as possible and get the answer key up there. Okay. All right. Have a safe weekend. I will see you guys on Tuesday.